Imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where forgiveness has simply vanished. Not just from your vocabulary, but from your very nature. Every slight, every betrayal, every mistake becomes a permanent scar carved into the collective memory of humanity. No second chances, no redemption, no moving forward. Only the endless accumulation of grievances, stacking like stones until they bury us all. This isn't science fiction. This is human psychology, stripped of one of its most profound capacities. Throughout history, civilizations have risen and fallen on their ability to forgive or their refusal to do so. Blood feuds that lasted centuries, ethnic conflicts that consumed generations, families torn apart by grudges that outlived the people who started them. But what would happen if we couldn't forgive at all? If that fundamental human ability to let go, to heal, to start again, was simply erased from our emotional architecture? Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of human nature to explore what we'd become without forgiveness. We'll walk through the wreckage of relationships, communities, and entire societies built on nothing but accumulated resentment. We'll examine how our brains work when forgiveness is impossible, how our children would grow up in a world where every mistake echoes forever, and how the very fabric of civilization would unravel thread by thread. Because here's the thing most people don't realize about forgiveness. It's not just some nice spiritual concept your grandmother talked about. It's the invisible glue holding everything together. Your marriage, your friendships, your workplace, your government, your ability to sleep at night. Remove it, and watch how quickly paradise becomes hell. The Romans had a phrase, errare humanum est, to err is human. But in our world without forgiveness, error becomes unforgivable. And when humans can't forgive humans for being human, we stop being human altogether. So let's begin this journey into darkness. Let's see what monsters we become when mercy dies. Because only by understanding what we'd lose, can we truly appreciate what we have. And only by staring into that abyss, can we understand why forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the only thing standing between us and our own destruction. The first casualty in a world without forgiveness wouldn't be some grand institution or ancient tradition. It would be something far more intimate, far more devastating. It would be love itself. Because love, real love, is built on a foundation of forgiveness. And when that foundation crumbles, everything built upon it comes crashing down. Picture your closest relationship, your spouse, your best friend, your sibling. Now imagine every careless word they've ever spoken to you, every time they've let you down, every moment they've chosen themselves over you, all of it preserved in perfect, unforgiving detail. No healing, no moving past it, just an ever-growing catalogue of hurts that can never be resolved. In our world, we call this emotional baggage. In a world without forgiveness, we'd call it reality. Relationships would become fragile mathematical equations. Two people starting with a finite amount of goodwill, spending it down with every human mistake, every momentary selfishness, every failure to be perfect. And once that account hits zero, it's over, permanently. No forgiveness means no refilling that account. No second chances means no hope of repair. Marriage would become a terrifying gamble. Two imperfect people promising to never hurt each other, knowing that the first real wound would be the last. Divorce rates wouldn't just skyrocket, they'd become meaningless statistics because marriage itself would become extinct. Why risk permanent emotional bankruptcy when you could simply avoid the investment altogether? But it gets worse, because humans don't just hurt each other through grand betrayals or dramatic moments. We hurt each other through the 1,000 tiny cuts of daily life, the forgotten anniversary, the dismissive comment, the time we were too tired to listen, the moment we chose our phone over our partner's story about their day. In our world, These moments get smoothed over by forgiveness. We apologize, we move on, we try to do better. But in a world without forgiveness, each tiny cut becomes a permanent scar. And scars don't heal. So you've witnessed the collapse of the most intimate bonds, marriages crumbling under the weight of unforgivable slights, friendships shattering like glass against stone. But this is just the beginning. Because when forgiveness dies in the human heart, it doesn't stop at our bedroom doors or kitchen tables. It seeps outward like poison through water, contaminating every institution, every community, every sacred space we've built to hold society together. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow and every grudge, every slight, every moment of betrayal that's ever occurred in your community suddenly becomes permanent, unforgivable, set in stone. What happens to the very fabric of civilization when the thread that weaves us back together after we tear apart simply vanishes? Let's start with the most basic building block of human society, the neighborhood. That collection of houses and families that forms the cellular structure of every community on Earth. In our world, neighborhoods function because of an invisible agreement. We forgive, we overlook, we let things slide. Your neighbor's dog barks too late into the night, but you don't call the police because, well, it's just Bob and his wife's been sick. The kids next door hit a baseball through your window, but you know they're good kids, and accidents happen. These small acts of forgiveness, barely conscious most of the time, are what keep neighborhoods from becoming war zones. But remove forgiveness entirely and watch what happens. That barking dog becomes an unforgivable assault on your peace. The broken window transforms from childhood accident to deliberate property destruction. The music that's slightly too loud, the garbage cans left out a day too long, the property line dispute that could have been settled with a handshake and a beer. All of these become permanent, festering wounds. Within months, maybe weeks, your neighborhood splits into factions. The Hendersons haven't spoken to the Johnsons since the lawnmower incident. The Martinez family has declared war on anyone who parks within 50 feet of their driveway. Mrs. Chen has documented every transgression in a leather-bound journal, preparing for the reckoning that must surely come. But neighborhoods are just the beginning, because humans don't just live in houses scattered across suburban streets. We gather, we worship, we work, we create institutions designed to bring us together in common purpose. And every single one of these institutions relies on forgiveness to survive. Take the workplace. Not the sanitized HR-managed corporate environment of today, but the raw human reality of people thrown together by economic necessity, forced to collaborate despite their differences, their conflicts, their inevitable mistakes. In our world, workplace tensions get resolved, sometimes through formal processes, sometimes through time and perspective, but almost always through some form of forgiveness. The colleague who took credit for your idea eventually makes it right. The boss who embarrassed you in front of the team shows up at your office with an apology. The co-worker who consistently arrives late finally gets their act together, and you let bygones be bygones. Strip away forgiveness, and the workplace becomes a battlefield of permanent resentments. Every perceived slight becomes an eternal grievance. The promotion that went to someone else isn't just disappointing, it's an unforgivable betrayal that demands vengeance. The criticism from your supervisor isn't constructive feedback. It's an assault on your character that can never be overlooked. Teams fracture into warring tribes. Departments become armed camps. The collaborative spirit that drives innovation and productivity dies under the weight of accumulated grudges. Companies split apart like cells dividing, but instead of creating new life, they create new enemies. And then there are our sacred spaces, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, the places where humans gather to touch something larger than themselves, to find meaning, to seek redemption. These institutions don't just preach forgiveness, they're built on it. The very foundation of most religious traditions rests on the radical idea that mistakes can be erased, that redemption is possible, that humans can be more than the worst thing they've ever done. But imagine walking into a church where forgiveness has been surgically removed from the doctrine, where every sin, every mistake, every moment of human weakness is recorded and remembered forever, where the congregation keeps detailed records of who tithed late, who missed too many services, who sang off key during the hymns, where the pastor's sermon from 5 years ago, the one that offended the Williams family, is still referenced in hushed, angry whispers. These sacred spaces, meant to be sanctuaries from the harsh judgments of the world, become courtrooms of eternal condemnation. Congregations split along lines of ancient grievances. New churches form, not from theological differences, but from unforgivable personal slights. The healing that religion promises becomes impossible when the very mechanism of healing has been removed. Schools face their own crisis. Teachers who can never forgive a disruptive student. Students who can never forgive an unfair grade. Parents who can never forgive a coach's decision. The learning environment, which requires risk-taking, mistake-making, and growth, becomes toxic when every error carries permanent consequences. The student who plagiarized a paper in freshman year is still defined by that choice as a senior. The teacher who lost their temper once becomes forever branded as abusive. The principal who made a controversial policy decision finds their authority undermined by parents who simply cannot let it go. But perhaps nowhere is the absence of forgiveness more devastating than in our justice system. Now, you might think the justice system is already pretty unforgiving. We lock people up, we punish crimes, we demand accountability. But even our harshest legal frameworks are built on the assumption that debt can be paid, that sentences can be served, that redemption is possible. Remove forgiveness from justice and punishment becomes eternal. Every crime, no matter how small, carries a life sentence. The teenager who shoplifts a candy bar is marked forever. The person who makes one terrible decision in a moment of weakness never gets a second chance. The very concept of rehabilitation disappears because there's no possibility of society ever accepting that someone has truly changed. Prisons become permanent warehouses for the irredeemable. Parole boards cease to exist because there's no such thing as paying your debt to society when society can never forgive the debt. Crime rates don't decrease because the deterrent effect is overwhelmed by the desperation of people who know that one mistake will cost them everything. And here's where it gets truly terrifying, because humans, when cornered, when offered no path to redemption, when told that their mistakes define them forever, don't simply accept their fate. They fight back. They embrace the very thing they're accused of being. If society will never forgive you for being a thief, why not steal everything you can? If you're going to be treated as a monster for one bad decision, why not become the monster they insist you are? The absence of forgiveness doesn't create a more moral society. It creates a society where morality becomes meaningless because there's no reward for choosing good over evil. Why be good when good deeds can't erase past mistakes? Why try to improve when improvement is never recognized? Why seek redemption when redemption is impossible? But the true horror of a world without forgiveness isn't just in how it treats the guilty, it's in how it transforms the innocent. Because in a world where every slight is permanent, where every mistake is unforgivable, the innocent become paranoid, defensive, and ultimately cruel. You learn to strike first because you know that any offense against you will never be resolved. You become hyper-vigilant, cataloguing every potential slight, every possible transgression, because you know these wounds will never heal. You develop a fortress mentality, protecting yourself against a world where everyone is a potential enemy and no one can ever truly be trusted again. The very qualities that make us human our capacity for growth, our ability to learn from mistakes, our potential for transformation, all of these become irrelevant in a world where the past is immutable and the future is determined by the worst things we've ever done. And slowly, inexorably, society begins to fragment. Not along traditional lines of race or class or ideology, though those divisions certainly deepen. No, society fractures along the lines of accumulated grievance. Every family, every community, every institution splits into smaller and smaller pieces as unforgivable offences pile up like sediment, burying any hope of reconciliation under layers of permanent resentment. The social contract, that invisible agreement that allows millions of strangers to coexist peacefully, dissolves. Because that contract was always based on the understanding that people could change, that mistakes could be forgiven, that tomorrow offered the possibility of redemption. Remove that possibility, and the contract becomes void. What you're left with isn't a society at all. It's a collection of isolated individuals and small tribes, each nursing their own unforgivable wounds, each viewing everyone else as a potential threat to be neutralized rather than a potential ally to be embraced. This is what happens when forgiveness dies in the spaces between us. When the glue that holds communities together dissolves. When our institutions become weapons rather than havens. When our sacred spaces become courtrooms, and our schools become prisons, and our justice system becomes a machine for creating permanent outcasts. But we're not done yet, because there's another level to this nightmare. A deeper horror that awaits when forgiveness doesn't just disappear from our personal relationships and social institutions, but vanishes from the very structures of power that govern our lives. What happens when nations can't forgive? When governments operate without mercy? When the machinery of state loses its capacity for clemency? That's where we're headed next. As personal relationships crumble and societal structures collapse, the absence of forgiveness begins to reshape the very foundation of human civilization itself. What emerges is not merely a harsher world, but a fundamentally different species of humanity. One that has forgotten how to heal, how to grow, and ultimately, how to hope. In this unforgiving reality, the concept of redemption becomes extinct. Every mistake becomes a permanent scar. Every wrong turn a dead end with no possibility of return. The drunk driver who killed someone in a moment of terrible judgment remains forever the killer, never allowed to become the advocate for safe driving who might save countless lives. The reformed gang member can never become the youth counselor who pulls others from the streets. The recovering addict is eternally defined by their lowest moment, never permitted to inspire others toward recovery. This erasure of second chances doesn't just affect individuals. It fundamentally alters how we understand human nature itself. Without forgiveness, we lose the belief that people can change, that growth is possible, that redemption exists. We become a society that sees character as fixed, morality as absolute, and human beings as incapable of transformation. The workplace becomes a minefield of permanent grudges. A single professional mistake follows you forever, creating a culture where innovation dies because risk-taking becomes professionally suicidal. Teams fragment into isolated individuals who dare not collaborate for fear that any failure will be attributed to them personally and held against them indefinitely. Mentorship disappears because why would anyone invest in developing someone who might later compete with them and whose future betrayals could never be forgiven? Educational systems transform into sorting mechanisms rather than places of growth. Students are categorized early and permanently. A poor performance in elementary school becomes a scarlet letter that follows through high school, college, and beyond. Teachers stop believing in the potential for improvement because they've seen too many former students whose past mistakes haunt them decades later. The very concept of learning from failure becomes meaningless when failure is permanent. In families, children grow up in environments where every tantrum, every lie, every moment of rebellion is catalogued and held as evidence of their fundamental character. Parents, unable to forgive their children's mistakes, raise offspring who learn that love is conditional and temporary. These children in turn become adults who have never experienced unconditional acceptance, creating a generational cycle of emotional stunted growth and relationship dysfunction. The criminal justice system evolves into something purely punitive. Without the possibility of rehabilitation or redemption, prisons become warehouses for the permanently damned. Former inmates, branded forever by their worst moments, have no incentive to reform, because society offers no path back. Recidivism becomes inevitable, not because people can't change, but because an unforgiving world ensures they're never allowed to demonstrate that change. Religious and spiritual institutions, traditionally the guardians of forgiveness and mercy, undergo their own dark transformation. Sacred texts are reinterpreted to emphasize judgment over compassion. Spiritual leaders become prosecutors rather than healers. The very concept of divine mercy becomes heretical because it contradicts the new social order where mistakes are unforgivable and redemption is impossible. Perhaps most tragically, this world loses its capacity for moral progress. Social movements that have historically depended on society's ability to acknowledge past wrongs and forgive in service of a better future become impossible. The civil rights movement could never have succeeded if society was incapable of forgiving its racist past while working toward a more just future. Women's suffrage would have failed if the goal was permanent punishment of men rather than the creation of a more equitable society. In this unforgiving landscape, innovation in human relationships stops entirely. Marriage becomes a contract between two people who must be perfect from day one, because any flaw, any mistake, any moment of weakness becomes grounds for permanent rejection. Friendship becomes a series of temporary alliances that dissolve the moment someone disappoints. Love becomes conditional, fragile, and ultimately superficial, because true intimacy requires the vulnerability that comes from knowing you can make mistakes and still be accepted. The psychological toll is immeasurable. Humans living under the constant threat of permanent condemnation develop chronic anxiety, depression, and paranoia. Mental health becomes a luxury because admitting to psychological struggles means admitting to imperfection, which in an unforgiving world is tantamount to social suicide. Therapy becomes impossible because healing requires acknowledging mistakes and working through them. But in a world without forgiveness, acknowledgement of mistakes is just evidence for future punishment. Children growing up in this environment develop fundamentally different psychological structures. They learn to hide their mistakes rather than learn from them. They become expert at deception, manipulation, and blame shifting, because honesty about failure is too dangerous. They never develop genuine empathy, because they're too focused on protecting themselves from the consequences of their own inevitable human imperfections. The concept of wisdom dies, because wisdom traditionally comes from learning from mistakes, reflecting on failures, and growing through experience. But in a world where mistakes are unforgivable, there's no incentive to reflect, no safety in acknowledging error, and no possibility of growth through failure. Society becomes stuck in a perpetual adolescence, unable to mature because maturity requires the humility that comes from accepting and learning from our imperfections. Art, literature, and creative expression undergo their own transformation. The great works of human creativity have historically explored themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of human transformation. Without these concepts, artistic expression becomes limited to either perfect characters who never fail or irredeemably evil ones who never change. The rich middle ground of human complexity, where most real people live, becomes unexpressible and therefore unexplored. Science and research suffer as well. Scientific progress depends on the ability to be wrong, to learn from failed experiments, and to build on previous mistakes. In an unforgiving world, researchers become afraid to propose bold hypotheses or conduct risky experiments because failure could end their careers permanently. Scientific collaboration becomes impossible when researchers fear that association with failed projects could taint them forever. The very language begins to change. Words associated with forgiveness, mercy, redemption, and second chances gradually disappear from common usage because the concepts they represent no longer exist. New words emerge to describe the permanent categories of human worth, the hierarchies of past mistakes, the legal and social mechanisms for ensuring that errors are never forgotten or forgiven. This is what happens when forgiveness dies. It's not just that people become meaner or that society becomes harsher. It's that humanity loses its most essential characteristic, the ability to transcend its own imperfections through grace, mercy, and the radical act of choosing love over judgment, hope over condemnation, and the possibility of redemption over the certainty of punishment. The morning sun rises over a world that has forgotten mercy, and with it comes something humanity has never witnessed before: the complete collapse of justice itself. You might think that without forgiveness, justice would become stronger, more pure, more absolute. But you'd be wrong. Because justice without the possibility of redemption isn't justice at all. It's vengeance wearing a blindfold. Picture the courtrooms of this merciless world. No plea bargains exist because there's no point in negotiating when every crime carries the same weight. Permanent condemnation. Judges sit behind benches not to weigh evidence and determine appropriate consequences, but to catalogue sins for eternity. The gavel doesn't fall to deliver justice. It falls to brand souls with scarlet letters that will never fade. In this world, every legal system has transformed into something unrecognizable. Rehabilitation programs have been dismantled because what's the point of helping someone change when change is impossible? Prisons aren't correctional facilities. They're human warehouses where people are stored like broken furniture, waiting for nothing because nothing better will ever come. The very concept of serving your time and re-entering society has vanished because society refuses to believe anyone can truly serve enough time to earn a second chance. But here's where it gets really twisted. When forgiveness dies, so does the distinction between major and minor infractions. A child who steals a candy bar carries the same eternal mark as a murderer. Why? Because without the possibility of forgiveness, every wrong becomes equally unforgivable. The accountant who fudges numbers and the dictator who commits genocide are both just sinners, equally damned, equally irredeemable. The scales of justice don't weigh different crimes. They just collect them. And what happens to the concept of truth in this world? It becomes weaponized. Confession is no longer about accountability and healing. It's about collecting ammunition. People stop admitting mistakes because admission equals permanent exile. Truth-telling becomes the fastest way to destroy your own life. So lies multiply like cancer cells, growing and spreading until the entire justice system is built on deception, cover-ups, and the desperate scramble to appear perfect. Witnesses refuse to testify because helping catch a criminal means participating in their eternal destruction. Juries become execution squads, not because they're sentencing people to death, but because they're sentencing them to something worse. A lifetime of being unredeemable. The presumption of innocence crumbles because everyone knows that once you're accused, you're finished, regardless of the verdict. Even the victims lose in this system. They receive no healing because justice without mercy can't actually restore anything. It can only destroy. Victims become trapped in their trauma because the system offers them only vengeance, never resolution. They watch their attackers suffer eternally, but their own pain never diminishes because revenge is a poor substitute for peace. The legal profession itself becomes a nightmare. Lawyers stop defending clients because there's no defense against permanent condemnation. Public defenders quit en masse because they can't bear participating in a system designed only to damn. Prosecutors become professional destroyers of human souls, and the weight of it breaks them. Some flee to other careers. Others continue, but the light in their eyes dims a little more with each case. Law enforcement transforms into something darker too. Police officers know that every arrest they make isn't just stopping a crime, it's ending a life's potential forever. Some become drunk on this power, seeing themselves as angels of final judgment. Others are crushed by the responsibility and simply stop enforcing laws altogether. Crime rates skyrocket not because criminals are bolder, but because the guardians of society can no longer bear to guard it. And then there are the laws themselves. In a world without forgiveness, legislation becomes increasingly draconian because lawmakers know there will never be another chance to get it right. 3-strike laws become 1-strike laws. Minor infractions carry major penalties because if someone can never be forgiven, you might as well hit them hard the first time. The legal code swells to thousands of pages because every possible transgression must be perfectly defined and permanently punished. But perhaps the cruelest irony is what happens to the concept of justice for those who enforce it. Judges who make wrong decisions, police officers who use excessive force, lawyers who make mistakes in court, they too become unredeemable. The justice system begins to cannibalize itself as its own officers fall victim to the merciless machine they've created. Appeals courts become meaningless because there's no appeal from eternal condemnation. Children growing up in this world learn early that perfection isn't just expected, it's the only path to survival. Schools stop teaching about historical figures who overcame their mistakes because there are no such figures. Instead, they teach about the immutable categories of good and evil, saint and sinner, saved and damned. Students learn to hide their errors rather than learn from them, because every mistake is a step towards social death. The very language of justice evolves. Words like redemption, second chance, and rehabilitation disappear from legal vocabulary. Justice doesn't seek to make things right. It seeks to make classifications permanent. International law becomes impossible because no nation can forgive another's transgressions. Trade wars become actual wars because economic disputes can never be resolved, only escalated. Diplomatic immunity disappears because no crime can be overlooked for the sake of international relations. The world fragments into smaller and smaller entities as groups refuse to coexist with those who have wronged them, even generations ago. And in the end, this world discovers the most terrifying truth of all. Justice without forgiveness isn't justice. It's just organized cruelty. It's a system that creates more victims than it protects, more pain than it heals, more division than it resolves. It's the kind of justice that ultimately justifies nothing and destroys everything, including itself. In this world without forgiveness, humanity learns too late that mercy isn't justice's weakness, it's justice's soul. And without a soul, even the most perfectly constructed system of law and order becomes just another machine for grinding human dignity into dust. The gavel falls one final time, not in judgment, but in surrender. The absence of forgiveness doesn't just poison individual hearts, it metastasizes through entire civilizations, transforming societies into monuments of perpetual grievance and irreversible judgment. When mercy dies, What rises in its place isn't justice, it's something far more terrifying. A world where every mistake becomes a permanent scar, every transgression an eternal mark, and every human being a walking ledger of unpaid debts. Look around this unforgiving landscape, and you'll see the architecture of resentment. Courts that never close because cases never truly end. Prisons that expand endlessly because rehabilitation is impossible when redemption is forbidden. Schools that teach the careful cataloguing of wrongs, but never the art of letting go. Children who inherit their parents' grudges like genetic diseases, carrying hatred for crimes they never witnessed, nursing wounds they never received. In this world, relationships become archaeological expeditions through layers of accumulated hurt. Marriages crumble under the weight of every careless word preserved in perfect clarity. Friendships dissolve because a single betrayal, no matter how small, becomes a permanent chasm. Parents and children drift apart across oceans of unforgivable moments. Each interaction, a careful navigation around landmines of past disappointments. The economy of an unforgiving world operates on a currency of suffering. People hoard their pain like precious metals, trading in victimhood and investing in resentment. Forgiveness, after all, would devalue their carefully accumulated grievances. Why would you forgive the friend who forgot your birthday when that slight has earned you sympathy for 3 years running? Why would you release the co-worker who took credit for your idea when that injustice has justified your bitterness and won you allies in office politics? But perhaps nowhere is the absence of forgiveness more devastating than in the realm of justice itself. Without mercy to temper judgment, legal systems become machines of infinite punishment. Crimes echo through generations. A theft committed at 20 haunts a person at 60. A lie told in youth follows someone to their grave. There are no second chances because second chances require the radical act of forgetting, of choosing to see someone as more than the sum of their worst moments. The psychological toll is staggering. In a world without forgiveness, depression becomes epidemic because people cannot forgive themselves. Anxiety skyrockets because every interaction carries the potential for irreversible condemnation. Suicide rates climb because when redemption is impossible, death appears to be the only escape from the prison of permanent shame. Mental health becomes an oxymoron when healing requires the very thing that no longer exists. Religion in this world transforms into something unrecognizable. Gods become cosmic accountants, maintaining perfect records of every transgression with no possibility of absolution. Prayer becomes not supplication for mercy, but desperate bargaining with deities who never forget and never forgive. Sacred texts are edited to remove every mention of compassion, every parable of redemption, every promise of fresh starts. What remains are endless catalogues of rules and punishments, creating faithful who worship not out of love, but out of paralyzing fear. Even language itself begins to decay. Words related to forgiveness gradually disappear from dictionaries because unused words eventually die. Pardon, absolution, mercy, grace. These become archaic terms, museum pieces from a more naive time when people believed in the possibility of true redemption. New words emerge to fill the void, elaborate synonyms for grudge holding, nuanced terms for different types of permanent condemnation, complex vocabularies for measuring and maintaining resentment. The arts suffer perhaps the most profound transformation. Literature abandons redemptive arcs because happy endings require forgiveness. Music loses its capacity for resolution because harmony demands the reconciliation of discord. Visual arts become exercises in depicting permanent brokenness, endless fractures that never heal. Comedy dies entirely because laughter requires the ability to forgive human folly. All that remains is tragedy, and even tragedy loses its cathartic power when suffering leads nowhere but to more suffering. Innovation grinds to a halt because progress requires the ability to forgive failure. Scientists who make mistakes are permanently discredited. Entrepreneurs who fail once are forever barred from trying again. Artists whose early work disappoints are condemned to eternal mediocrity. Society stagnates because taking risks becomes unthinkable when the cost of failure is permanent exile from respectability. Perhaps most terrifying of all, this unforgiving world begins to reshape human nature itself. Children born into societies without mercy never develop the capacity for compassion. They learn to see fellow humans not as flawed beings deserving of understanding, but as potential threats to be monitored and judged. Empathy atrophies like an unused muscle. Love becomes conditional and temporary, always ready to be withdrawn at the first sign of imperfection. The elderly in this world carry the heaviest burden of all. Decades of accumulated grievances weigh them down like chains. They become living libraries of resentment, their minds filled not with wisdom, but with carefully preserved catalogues of every wrong ever done to them. They die bitter and alone, unable to find peace, because peace requires the release that forgiveness provides. Yet even in this bleak landscape, something remarkable happens. The very absence of forgiveness reveals its true nature and necessity. Like a drought that makes us appreciate water, the complete lack of mercy illuminates just how essential it is to human flourishing. We begin to understand that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the human arsenal. It's not naive optimism. It's the most practical approach to living together on a planet where everyone is imperfect. Forgiveness, we realize, is what makes civilization possible. It's the invisible foundation upon which every friendship rests, every marriage endures, every community survives. It's what allows parents to love children who disappoint them, what enables societies to integrate former criminals, what makes peace possible after war. Without it, we don't become perfect. We become perfectly isolated, perfectly bitter, perfectly broken. The world without forgiveness is ultimately unsustainable because humans are social creatures who require connection to survive, and connection is impossible without the capacity to overlook each other's inevitable failures. A society that cannot forgive is a society that cannot love, cannot grow, cannot hope. It's a society that dies slowly, suffocating under the weight of its own accumulated resentments. And so, we return to the question that began this journey. In a world without forgiveness, what would we become? The answer is clear and terrifying. We would become nothing at all, because forgiveness isn't just something nice that humans do when they're feeling generous. It's the very essence of what makes us human. Take it away, and what remains isn't a purer or more just version of humanity. It's something else entirely, something cold, calculating, and ultimately lifeless. The choice, thankfully, remains ours. We can choose to cultivate forgiveness in our own hearts, to practice mercy in our own relationships, to model grace in our own communities. We can choose to break the cycles of resentment that threaten to consume us. We can choose to remember that forgiveness doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It frees us from being defined by it forever. In the end, forgiveness isn't just a gift we give to others. It's a gift we give to ourselves, to our children, to the future itself. It's the choice to believe that people can change, that mistakes need not be permanent, that redemption is always possible. It's the radical decision to build a world not on the foundation of perfect justice, but on the cornerstone of transformative mercy. Without forgiveness, we become prisoners of the past, forever trapped by every hurt, every slight, every imperfection. With it, we become architects of hope, capable of building bridges across chasms of pain, of writing new chapters over old mistakes, of creating tomorrow from the ashes of yesterday's failures. The world without forgiveness is a world without hope. But the world with forgiveness, that's a world worth building, worth fighting for, worth becoming.